Welcome, true believers, to a quieter kind of story. Not a story of explosions or boardroom victories or the gleam of repulsor fire against a night sky, but a story about what a life leaves behind, and about the surprising shapes that inheritance takes when it passes from one pair of hands to the next. Tonight we're going to move gently through the world that Tony Stark built, and the world that outlasted him, following the threads of his legacy as they wind through the lives of the people he loved, the people he mentored, and the people who never met him at all but carry something of him forward nonetheless. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the armour to become something softer in your imagination tonight. There is no urgency here, no countdown, only the long, warm story of a man who was more than he believed himself to be, and the extraordinary truth of everything he left behind. The house that made Tony Stark was not a warm house. This is the first thing worth understanding about the man, and about everything that came after him, because a person's earliest understanding of what home means and what love looks like tends to shape the architecture of everything they build for the rest of their lives, whether they intend it to or not. Howard Stark built his family's residence in the same spirit in which he built everything else, with an engineer's attention to scale and function, and a visionary's disregard for the human beings who would actually have to live inside it. The mansion was large in the way that certain statements are large, not comfortable, not welcoming, but undeniably impressive. Its hallways wide enough for ambition, and its rooms arranged around the principle that important things happened here, rather than the quieter principle that people were loved here. There were staff, of course, and there was furniture chosen by designers whose names Howard could cite at dinner parties, and there were photographs on the walls that documented achievements rather than moments, trophies of a life conducted at altitude rather than at the intimate ground level where most human experience actually occurs. Howard Stark himself was a man of the mid-20th century in ways that both elevated and limited him. He had emerged from the period of the Second World War with a reputation built on genuine brilliance, a weapons contractor whose innovations had contributed meaningfully to the Allied effort, and whose face had appeared on the covers of enough magazines to ensure that the Stark name carried a specific weight in every room he entered. He was charismatic in the way that truly intelligent people sometimes are when they have also learned to perform their intelligence, rather than simply to exercise it, and he moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never seriously questioned whether he belonged at its centre. The work consumed him. This was not unusual for men of his generation and his particular variety of ambition, and the people around him had long since made their peace with the fact that Howard Stark's primary relationship was always going to be with whatever problem he was currently trying to solve, and that the human beings in his life would need to arrange themselves around that central fact, rather than expecting to occupy the centre themselves. Maria Stark was a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable patience, and the combination of those qualities had made her an effective partner in the social and institutional dimensions of Howard's world, while also, over the years, producing in her a certain quiet sadness that she carried gracefully enough that most people never noticed it. She loved her son. This is perhaps the most important thing that can be said about her in the context of Tony's story, because her love was the warmer and more legible of the two parental forces operating in the Stark household, and it was the love that Tony would reach for in memory whenever the world required him to believe that someone had genuinely cared about him as a person, rather than as a continuation of a name or a carrier of a genetic line. She read to him. She sat with him when he was ill. She asked questions about his projects that suggested she was genuinely curious, rather than performing interest for his benefit. These things mattered more than the mansion's dimensions or Howard's reputation, and Tony would know this, though he would spend a long time knowing it only in the inarticulate way that children know the most essential things, without the vocabulary to explain what they understand. Howard's relationship with his son was conducted at a remove that he himself probably experienced as appropriate rather than damaging, because the emotional vocabulary of his generation and his particular psychology did not offer him many ways to understand the difference between demanding excellence from a child and loving one. He saw Tony's extraordinary intelligence early, recognized it with something that looked from a distance like pride but felt from the inside more like relief, as though the boy's obvious aptitude confirmed that the investment of the Stark name and the Stark genes had produced a return worth having. He pushed Tony academically with the same focused pressure he applied to engineering problems, presenting challenges and withdrawing approval when the results fell short of what he believed the boy was capable of, and never quite understanding that a child who is perpetually reaching for a standard that keeps being moved upward does not experience this as motivation so much as a slow accumulation of evidence that he will never be quite enough. Tony was admitted to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at the age of 15, which is perhaps the most efficient single fact for conveying the particular quality of his early intelligence. He was not simply smart in the way that top students at ordinary schools are smart. He was operating at a level of abstraction and synthesis that placed him in genuinely rarefied company, even among his peers at one of the world's most rigorous technical institutions, and the professors who encountered him during those years tended to remember him not just for the quality of his work but for the specific texture of his mind, its restlessness, its delight in connection, its capacity for holding multiple frameworks simultaneously and finding the places where they unexpectedly converged. He was also, by every account, a difficult person to be around in those years, loud and performative in his brilliance, in the way that young people often are when they have learned that intellectual display is the currency that earns them the attention they are not receiving through ordinary affection. The friendships he formed at university were real, in their way, though they tended to be organised around shared projects and intellectual excitement rather than around the slower and more demanding work of genuine emotional intimacy. He was charming, which is different from being warm, and he was generous with his time and his resources in ways that looked like friendship, but sometimes served the additional function of keeping people at a specific distance, close enough to provide company and admiration, but not so close that they might notice what he was keeping carefully out of sight. The grief underneath the performance, the loneliness of a boy who had grown up in a house full of extraordinary things and very little ordinary love. Howard and Maria Stark died in a car accident when Tony was still quite young, a fact that the public record presented as a tragedy, and that Tony experienced as something more complicated, a grief that was genuine and also entangled with questions that had no satisfying answers. About what his father had actually thought of him, about whether the approval he had spent his childhood trying to earn had ever been available to be earned at all, about what Howard had meant when he spoke about legacy, and whether Tony himself was supposed to understand that he was the legacy in question. The questions did not resolve themselves quickly. They would follow Tony for decades, surfacing in the way that unprocessed grief tends to surface, at unexpected moments, and in the shape of choices that seem to be about the present, but are actually negotiations with the past. Obadiah Stane stepped into the operational leadership of Stark Industries in the period following Howard's death with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this transition for some time, and who understood that the grieving son of a genius industrialist was not, in those early years, equipped to run a global corporation regardless of his obvious intelligence. Stane was avuncular and apparently warm, and he guided the company and the young man who nominally led it through the transition period with what appeared to be genuine care and what was in fact a sophisticated long game, played with patience and considerable skill in the service of interests that had very little to do with Tony's well-being or Howard's vision. Tony trusted him. This trust was not naive exactly, but it was the trust of someone who had not yet had cause to look closely at the people who offered themselves as anchors, because the alternative to trusting Stane was to stand alone in the middle of something enormous without a guide. And that alternative was, in those years, genuinely unthinkable. Stark Industries, under Tony's nominal leadership and Stane's operational guidance, became one of the most profitable and technologically sophisticated defense contractors in the world, and Tony spent the years of his early adulthood building the public version of himself with the same intensity he had once applied to university projects, constructing a persona so polished and so entertaining that most people engaged with the performance without ever wondering what it was performing over. The press conferences were theatrical, the product demonstrations were spectacular, the personal life was conducted in the tabloid register, a succession of relationships that never quite became partnerships, and a social calendar that ensured he was never in any one place long enough to be genuinely known. He built things. This was the constant beneath all the noise, the through line that connected the boy in the workshop to the man on the magazine cover, the particular joy he took in making things that had not existed before he decided they should, the satisfaction that was so reliable and so complete that it served, for a long time, as a functional substitute for the other kinds of satisfaction that his life was not providing. He was, by the standards of the world he moved through, enormously successful. He was also, by the standards of the life he was not quite living, quietly and persistently bereft. These two things coexisted in him for years with a stability that might have lasted indefinitely if Afghanistan had not intervened, and if a small cave in an inhospitable landscape had not provided him, at considerable cost, with the thing that all the success and all the performance had never managed to offer. The first genuine reason to understand what he actually valued, and therefore the first genuine foundation for becoming something more than Howard Stark's most impressive product. The convoy moved through the Afghan landscape on a morning that had the particular quality of light that high desert places produce, a clarity so complete and so indifferent that it makes everything visible and nothing feel safe, the kind of morning that would have been beautiful under different circumstances and that Tony Stark would remember for the rest of his life, in the way that people remember the last ordinary moment before everything changed. He had been in good spirits, as he understood good spirits in those years, loose and performative, and slightly disconnected from the seriousness of where he was and what the people around him were actually doing there. Because the performance of ease had become so habitual by that point that it operated even in contexts where ease was genuinely inappropriate. He had been demonstrating a weapons system, which was the work that had built everything he lived inside, and he had done it with the practiced confidence of someone who had stood at the front of enough rooms that standing at the front of rooms had ceased to feel like anything at all. What happened next is the kind of thing that resists precise narration, not because the facts are unclear, but because the facts are not really the point. An ambush, an explosion. The particular violence of people who wanted Tony Stark dead, or captured, or both, using weapons that bore the Stark Industries logo on their casings. A detail that Tony would absorb later with the specific quality of nausea that accompanies the recognition of one's own complicity in something terrible. The soldiers who had been travelling with him were killed. Tony himself was caught in the blast and survived it in the technical sense of the word, which is to say that his heart continued to beat and his lungs continued to move air, though the shrapnel that had entered his chest was working its way incrementally toward that heart with the patient indifference of metal in a body that was never designed to contain it. He woke in a cave. This is where the story that matters actually begins. Not in the mansion or the university or the press conferences or the workshops where the armor's earlier iterations had been dreamed into existence, but in a cave in Afghanistan with a car battery connected to an electromagnet connected to his chest, keeping him alive in the most provisional and humbling way imaginable. The wound was real in a way that Tony had never been required to be real before. The danger was not abstract or theoretical or something that happened to other people in other places, while he stood at a podium and described the technical specifications of the system designed to address it. The danger was in his chest, moving, and the only thing standing between him and it was a device so crude and so immediate that it stripped away everything he had ever used to maintain the comfortable distance between himself and his own mortality. Ho Yinsen was a physician, a fellow captive, and the man who had built the electromagnet that was keeping Tony alive. He was also, though Tony would only understand this gradually, something that Tony had not had in any reliable way since his mother died, which was a person who saw him clearly and was not disappointed by what they saw. Yinsen had his own grief, his own losses, a family that had been taken from him by the same broad category of violence that had now taken them both to this particular cave, and he carried this grief with a quietness and a dignity that stood in stark contrast to everything Tony had been trained to believe about the appropriate response to suffering, which was to not display it, to perform something more useful instead, to convert pain into productivity, and present the productivity to the world as though the pain had never existed. Yinsen did not do this. He was simply present with what had happened to him, and simply present with Tony. And the combination of these two qualities made him the most honest person Tony had been in close proximity to in a very long time. Their conversations in the cave during the hours that were not occupied by the work, they were both pretending to perform for their captors while actually performing something else entirely, were the conversations that remade Tony Stark at the foundational level. Not because Yinsen told him anything that he could not theoretically have known before, but because Yinsen asked him questions in a register of genuine curiosity rather than the more familiar register of professional assessment or social performance, and because Tony, stripped of every resource except his mind, and facing the concrete possibility of his own death. Found that he had no energy left for the usual performances and answered honestly for perhaps the first time in years. What did he value? What had he built that he was proud of in the way that a person is proud of something when the audience has gone home and there is no one left to be impressed? What would he want to have done with the time he'd been given if it turned out the time was nearly finished? The answers that surfaced in those conversations were not comfortable ones. The weapons were everywhere, including in the hands of the people who had put him in this cave. The company that bore his name had made choices under his nominal leadership and his actual inattention that he could not defend when he sat with them honestly in the dark. The life he had been living was, when examined without the usual distractions, less a life than a very elaborate and very convincing imitation of one, full of motion and noise and achievement, and almost entirely empty of the things that Yinsen described simply as worth having. Connection, responsibility to something beyond the self, the knowledge that the things you built made the world more livable, rather than more dangerous for people who had no say in whether you built them or not. The plan that emerged from those conversations was practical first and philosophical second, because Tony was constitutionally incapable of approaching any problem from the philosophical direction before the engineering problem had been solved. They needed to survive. Survival required that their captors believed they were building what they had been ordered to build, while they were actually building something else entirely. Something that would allow them to get out of the cave and return Tony to the world outside it. The first armor was crude in every dimension that the later versions would refine into elegance. It was heavy and loud, and it moved with the graceful limitations of something built from available materials under conditions of extreme constraint. And it was also, in the most essential sense, exactly what it needed to be. A machine built for a single specific purpose by a man who had finally found a purpose worth building toward. Yinsen's death in the attempt to escape was the second great wound of that period, following the first by only days but arriving with a different quality of pain. Not the physical shock of shrapnel and heat, but the grief of watching someone who had given him something irreplaceable choose to spend their remaining time ensuring that the gift was not wasted. Tony held him. This is the detail that matters, not the tactical circumstances or the noise of what was happening around them, but the fact that a man who had spent his adult life maintaining careful emotional distance held a dying friend and listened to what he had to say. Yinsen told him not to waste it. He said it simply, without drama, as a person says the most important thing when they know it is the last thing they will have the opportunity to say. Do not waste it. Do not go back to the life you were living before this cave. The cave was terrible, and it was also, Yinsen understood, and Tony was beginning to understand, the most honest place Tony had ever been. And honesty, even when it arrives in the shape of shrapnel and captivity, is a gift that deserves to be honoured. Tony returned to the world outside the cave wearing the electromagnetic device in his chest that had kept him alive and carrying, less visibly, but no less concretely, everything that the cave had clarified. The arc reactor that he developed in the weeks following his return was both a technological improvement on the cave's makeshift electromagnet and a physical symbol of the transformation that had occurred, a power source built around a wound, a reminder of mortality converted into the mechanism of survival, worn against the chest where it could not be ignored or forgotten or managed from a comfortable distance. He looked at it every morning. This was not, over time, a painful thing. It became instead a kind of orientation device, a way of remembering what was real and what was performance, what had been given to him by the accident of his birth and his name, and what had been earned in a cave in Afghanistan by a man who had finally been required to discover what he actually cared about. The press conference that followed his return was unlike any public appearance he had made before, not because it was more polished or more spectacular, but because it was, bewilderingly to everyone in the room, entirely sincere. He sat down, which was not what press conferences were for, and he said that he had been doing a great deal of thinking, which was not the sentence that the assembled journalist had expected, and he said that Stark Industries would no longer manufacture weapons, which was the sentence that nobody in the room could quite process in real time, because it was not the sentence that any version of Tony Stark they had ever encountered was capable of producing. The room did not know what to do with a Tony Stark who had decided to mean something. The room was accustomed to a Tony Stark who performed meaning very convincingly, while keeping the actual substance of himself carefully out of reach. Obadiah Stane's reaction to the announcement was professionally composed in public and considerably less composed in private. Because the business model that Stane had spent years carefully tending had just been unilaterally dismantled by the man who technically owned it, and the long game that Stane had been playing with such patience and such skill was suddenly operating in a landscape that no longer resembled the one he had planned for. The confrontation between them, when it eventually came, would reveal the full shape of Stane's actual intentions and the full depth of the betrayal that had been operating quietly inside Tony's professional life for years. But that confrontation was still in the future on the day of the press conference, and Tony sat at the table with the arc reactor steady in his chest and said what he meant, perhaps for the first time in a public setting, and felt the strange and unfamiliar sensation of a man who has decided to stop performing and start living, which is at once profoundly relieving and profoundly frightening, because there is no armour quite as effective as the one you wear on the inside, and taking it off requires a courage that is different in kind from anything the actual armour would ever demand of him. The second armour, built in the workshop of the Malibu house in the weeks following his return, was where Tony Stark, the engineer, and Tony Stark, the man who had sat in a cave with Yinsen, began to find a way to occupy the same body. He worked with the focused pleasure of someone who has finally found a project commensurate with their actual capabilities, not weapons testing, not stock performance, not the management of a public image, but the genuine, absorbing, endlessly interesting problem of building a machine that could do what he was increasingly certain needed to be done. The suit was red and gold because those were the colours he chose, and the choice was personal in the way that serious choices are personal, not arbitrary but not easily explained either. The colours of something that was meant to be seen rather than to hide. The colours of someone who had decided that the performance was over and the work was beginning. He flew it for the first time on a night when the Santa Monica sky was clear, and the city spread below him like a proof of concept, and the sensation of it was not what he might have anticipated, not triumph or vindication, but something quieter and more lasting, the particular satisfaction of a man who has finally found the right use for the tools he was given. The years that followed Tony's return from Afghanistan were years of reconstruction, and reconstruction is slower and more interior work than the word suggests when it appears in a news headline or a company quarterly report. From the outside, what was visible was a transformation of Stark Industries, the pivot away from weapons manufacturing and toward clean energy research, advanced materials, and the kind of technological development that could be presented to the world as unambiguously beneficial rather than contingently so. From the inside, what was actually happening was a man learning, with considerable difficulty and considerable patience with himself, how to build a life that corresponded to the values he had discovered in a cave rather than the values he had inherited from a household that had never quite found a language for them. These two projects, the external and the internal, proceeded simultaneously and influenced each other in ways that were not always obvious but were always real, because the things a person chooses to build are never entirely separate from the person they are in the process of becoming. The workshops in the Malibu house became the truest expression of this period. They were not the sterile institutional laboratories of Stark Industries' official research divisions, though those existed and were staffed by brilliant people doing important work. The workshops were personal in the way that a painter's studio is personal, organised according to a logic that was entirely Tony's own, accumulating the evidence of his thinking in physical form across every surface, half-finished designs alongside completed systems alongside fragments of ideas that had not yet resolved themselves into anything buildable, but that he was not ready to abandon. He worked at hours that corresponded to his own rhythms rather than to any schedule that the world outside the glass walls of the house might have found reasonable, and the work had a quality of absorption during this period that it had not always possessed before Afghanistan, because he was no longer building toward a performance or a demonstration or a quarterly target, but towards something he genuinely wanted to understand, which is the condition under which the best work of any kind tends to happen. The arc reactor in his chest remained the physical centre of everything, not just as a power source, but as an orientation, a daily reminder of the question that Yinsen had helped him locate in the cave, and that he was now attempting to answer through every decision he made about what to build and what to dismantle. There were mornings when he stood in the workshop in the early hours and looked at the soft blue light of it reflected in the glass and felt the full weight of what it represented, not with self-pity, which was not really in his emotional vocabulary, but with a kind of sober gratitude that this particular wound had produced this particular clarity, and that he had survived long enough to do something with it. The light did not let him forget. He had decided, somewhere in the weeks following his return, that he did not want to forget, that the forgetting would be a second betrayal of everything Yinsen had given him, and so the arc reactor served a function beyond the biological. It served as a covenant, quietly worn and quietly honoured. Quietly. Pepper Potts had been his executive assistant before Afghanistan and became, in the years following his return, something considerably more essential and considerably more difficult to categorise within the usual organisational hierarchies of a major corporation. She had been extraordinarily good at her job from the beginning, possessed of the kind of comprehensive and quietly applied intelligence that makes the people around it more capable, without necessarily calling attention to itself, and she had managed the considerable complexity of Tony's professional life with an efficiency and a good humour that most people in her position would not have been able to sustain for as long as she had sustained it. She knew where everything was, which in Tony's world meant considerably more than the literal files and the scheduled appointments. It meant the threads of ongoing projects and the status of relationships that had not been formally documented, and the particular sensitivities of the people Tony needed to work with, but sometimes forgot to treat as people rather than as variables in a larger equation. What changed after Afghanistan was not Pepper's competence, which had never been in question, but the nature of what she was being asked to manage and the degree to which Tony was actually present for the management of it. The man who returned from the cave was more difficult in some ways than the man who had left, more insistent on understanding the reasoning behind decisions rather than simply approving them, more likely to overturn established procedures when the procedures no longer seemed to serve the purpose he had decided they were supposed to serve. But he was also, for the first time in the years she had known him, genuinely paying attention, and the experience of having Tony Stark's full attention directed at a problem rather than the surface of a problem was both more demanding and more rewarding than the previous arrangement had been. She rose to meet it. This was the quality in Pepper that Tony recognised slowly and valued enormously once he had recognised it, that she did not perform her capabilities but simply exercised them, and that the exercise was always in service of something real rather than something impressive. Their relationship developed with the particular slowness of two people who are both aware that something significant is happening between them and both sufficiently intelligent to understand that moving too quickly would damage something worth preserving. Tony's previous approach to romantic relationships had been the same as his previous approach to most things that involved emotional risk, which is to say performative and ultimately self-protective, engaging fully in the surface of connection while keeping the deeper layers carefully unavailable. Pepper was not susceptible to this approach, not because she was immune to his charm, which was genuine even when it was also strategic, but because she'd spent enough years watching him operate to understand the difference between Tony performing and Tony meaning it, and she'd made a quiet, private decision somewhere along the way that she was only interested in the second version. This meant that the relationship that eventually developed between them was built on a foundation of genuine knowledge of each other, rather than the more usual foundation of mutual projection, which made it more durable than anything Tony had previously attempted, and also, in its early stages, more frightening. Because he was aware that she actually knew him, and that the approval she offered was therefore not the approval of someone who had been successfully deceived, but the approval of someone who had seen everything and chosen to stay anyway. She became Chief Executive Officer of Stark Industries, in the period when Tony's activities as Iron Man required a degree of attention and time that made it genuinely impossible for him to function as the company's operational leader, rather than its symbolic one, and the transition was smoother than most corporate restructurings, because Pepper had been doing the substantive work of leadership for years before the title acknowledged it. She ran the company with the same quality of comprehensive attention she had always brought to her work, and she ran it well. Which surprised almost no one who had worked closely with her, and surprised a great many people who had worked closely with Tony, and assumed that Stark Industries' success was primarily a function of his specific genius, rather than of the broader institutional intelligence that Pepper had spent years quietly building around it. She also continued to love him, which was a choice she renewed with full awareness of its complications, because loving Tony Stark in those years was not a simple or an unchallenging thing, and anyone who chose it did so understanding that the armor was real and the risk was real, and that the man inside both of them was worth the difficulty. Happy Hogan occupied a different position in Tony's world, but one that was no less essential to understanding the full shape of what Tony was building during this period. Happy had come into Tony's life as a driver and a bodyguard, roles that he performed with a conscientious thoroughness that belied the somewhat rumpled impression he tended to make on first encounter, and he had remained in Tony's orbit through every subsequent reconfiguration of Tony's life and priorities because he possessed a quality that Tony needed more than he usually acknowledged needing, which was uncomplicated loyalty that asked nothing in return except to be treated with basic respect. And that was not contingent on Tony being impressive or useful or performing at any particular level. Happy was fond of Tony in the way that certain people are fond of someone they have watched grow and struggle and change over many years, with an affection that is not blind to the flaws, but has decided that the flaws are part of the person, and the person is worth the affection. He noticed things, he remembered things. He showed up consistently and without requiring recognition for the showing up. And in Tony's life, where so many relationships were organised around the exchange of value or the management of image, this particular quality of simple, reliable presence was more sustaining than Happy probably ever knew. The armour itself evolved during this period with a continuity that reflected the evolution of the man wearing it. Each new version addressed the limitations of the previous one with the focused intelligence of an engineer who was also his own most demanding client. But the improvements were never purely technical, never simply about thrust capacity or targeting systems or structural integrity in isolation, from the larger question of what the armour was for and what it said about the person inside it. Tony approached each iteration as a kind of argument with himself about what he was trying to accomplish and what resources were actually necessary to accomplish it. And the suits that emerged from this process were simultaneously the most sophisticated pieces of personal technology ever constructed and the most personal pieces of technology ever constructed, each one bearing the traces of whatever Tony had been thinking about when he built it, whatever fear he was trying to address, whatever capability he felt the mission demanded, whatever understanding of himself he had arrived at since the last version. The question of what he was protecting went through its own evolution during this period, and tracking it is perhaps the most direct way of tracking Tony's broader development as a person, rather than simply as a technologist. In the beginning, in the immediate aftermath of Afghanistan, the answer was relatively simple and relatively personal. He was protecting the people who could not protect themselves from the specific category of danger that his own industry had helped to create, and this was a moral reckoning as much as a heroic calling, a form of restitution as much as a form of service. This remained true and remained important, but as the years passed and his understanding of the world's complexity deepened, the answer expanded without losing its original core, encompassing broader categories of innocent people and longer time horizons and more systemic kinds of danger, until the thing he was protecting was something that resisted simple description, but that he could feel clearly when he held it in mind, something like the ongoing possibility of ordinary human life conducted without the specific terrors that unchecked power tends to produce. His relationship with his own mortality, established so concretely by the arc reactor and the shrapnel that had made it necessary, became a peculiarly generative anxiety during this period rather than a paralyzing one. Tony thought about death with the regularity of someone who carries its reminder against their chest, and the thinking produced not despair but a kind of urgency about the work, a determination to build things that would function without him, to create systems and relationships and institutions that did not depend on his continued presence to remain valuable. This instinct toward legacy, toward building things that would outlast him, was not new. Howard's shadow was long enough that Tony had grown up understanding that men of the Stark kind built things that persisted, but the nature of what he was trying to outlast had changed fundamentally. He was no longer trying to outlast Howard's expectations or the world's assessment of whether he was sufficient to the name he carried. He was trying to outlast his own fear that none of it would matter, that the cave and Yinsen and the arc reactor and all the subsequent choices would amount to nothing durable if he stopped paying attention for long enough. The armour in this light was not just protection. It was also evidence, renewable and continually updated, that he was still paying attention, still taking responsibility, still trying to be equal to what he'd been given and what he'd been taught, in a cave by a dying man, to value. If the arc reactor was the physical symbol of everything Tony Stark had discovered about himself in Afghanistan, then James Rhodes was the human symbol of everything that had been true about him before the cave and remained true after it. The continuity beneath the transformation, the person whose presence in Tony's life predated every version of the armor and outlasted every crisis that threatened to unmake the man inside it. Rhodey had known Tony when Tony was still primarily a performance with a genius underneath it, and he had known him after Afghanistan when the performance had been stripped away and something more honest and more difficult had taken its place. And his assessment of the person had not changed substantially between those two versions, not because he failed to notice the difference, but because the qualities he had always valued in Tony were not the qualities that Afghanistan had altered. The intelligence was the same, the fundamental decency, imperfectly expressed and sometimes spectacularly overridden by ego and fear, but genuinely present, was the same. The loyalty, when Tony chose to exercise it, was the same. Rhodey had seen enough of the world and enough of people to understand that a man who was worth knowing at 20 was usually worth knowing at 40. And he applied this understanding to his friendship with Tony with a steadiness that Tony did not always deserve, and always, in his better moments, recognized as the gift it was. Their friendship had its origins in Tony's university years, which is to say it had been forming for a very long time before either of them would have used the word friendship without some qualification, because the early dynamic between them contained enough friction and enough mutual exasperation to make the tenderness underneath it easy to overlook if you were not paying close attention. Rhodey was at MIT on a different trajectory entirely, a military scholarship student whose relationship to Tony's particular variety of unstructured brilliance was complicated by the fact that he had been trained to value discipline and institutional accountability precisely as highly as Tony had been trained to treat them as optional. They argued constantly in those early years, about methods and about priorities, and about the question of what intelligence was actually for, and the arguments were genuine rather than performative, which meant that they were also, over time, productive, because each of them was being required by the other to defend positions they actually held, rather than simply to perform cleverness for an appreciative audience. The military career that Rhodey built over the years following university was a genuine expression of who he was, rather than a compromise with his ambitions. And this is worth understanding clearly because it would become essential to understanding everything that came later between them. He believed in service, not in the abstract civic-minded way that people sometimes invoke service as a concept without quite meaning to submit to its actual demands, but in the concrete, daily institutional way that requires a person to subordinate their individual judgment to collective structures on a regular basis, and to find in that subordination not humiliation but a form of integrity. He was good at it. He rose through the ranks with the combination of competence and character that tends to produce genuine advancement rather than the purely political variety. And the people who served under him tended to remember him with the specific quality of respect that is reserved for leaders who are demanding because they hold themselves to the same standards they impose on others. His relationship with Stark Industries and with Tony's activities as Iron Man required him to occupy a position that had no real institutional category, a military officer with personal access to a private individual whose activities had significant national security implications and whose cooperation with official structures was contingent on his own assessment of whether those structures were behaving in ways he could respect. This was not a comfortable position for someone with Rhodey's values, and he navigated it with a care and a frustration that he expressed to Tony directly and often, because one of the consistent features of their friendship was that Rhodey did not manage Tony's feelings at the expense of his own honesty. He told Tony when he thought he was wrong. He told him when he thought he was being reckless, when he thought his ego was operating where his judgment should have been, when the choices that seemed obviously correct to Tony seemed considerably less obviously correct to someone who was also accountable to institutions beyond the self. Tony did not always receive this feedback gracefully. He received it consistently, which is what mattered. The first time Rhodey wore the Iron Man armor was not a theft, though it was sometimes described that way in the simplified versions of the story that circulated afterward, and understanding why it was not a theft is essential to understanding the relationship at its depth. Tony was in crisis, a specific and serious one involving the arc reactor's effect on his body, and a psychological deterioration that he had chosen to manage privately, rather than by asking for help, which was such a characteristic choice that it hardly requires annotation. the party at the Malibu house, the armor in the wrong hands, the confrontation between two people who loved each other and were both, in that moment, operating at the outer edges of their capacity for restraint. Rhodey took the suit because the situation required someone to take the suit, and he was the person present who had the combination of capability and trustworthiness that the situation demanded, and the fact that Tony experienced it as a betrayal was a function of the crisis rather than an accurate assessment of the act. What it revealed, the taking of the suit and everything that followed from it, was that Tony had always known on some level that the armor needed to be wearable by someone else. That the responsible version of what he was building was a version that did not depend entirely on his own continued functioning, and that Rhodey was the person he had always implicitly trusted with that contingency, even when he was most loudly insisting that no one else could be trusted with it. The War Machine armor that was developed in the period following that confrontation was not simply a militarized version of the Iron Man suit, though it was that on a technical level, with weapon systems and structural modifications appropriate to the institutional context in which Rhodey would be operating it. It was also a formalization of something that had been true informally for a long time, the acknowledgement that Tony Stark's legacy in the form of the armor technology was not exclusively Tony Stark's to determine, that it had implications and applications beyond his personal heroic mission, and that the person he trusted to explore those implications was standing right in front of him. Rhodey's approach to the War Machine identity reflected his character with the same fidelity that Tony's approach to Iron Man reflected his. Where Tony operated as an individual, making decisions in real time according to his own assessment of situations and his own moral framework, Rhodey operated as part of a structure, bringing the armor's capabilities to bear within chains of command and institutional frameworks that he respected, without being naive about their limitations. He was more cautious than Tony in the field, and more reliable in the sense that his behavior was more predictable, not because he was less capable of independent judgment, but because he genuinely believed that reliable, accountable power was more valuable in the long run than brilliant but unpredictable power, and this belief was not an accommodation to institutional pressure, but a considered position that he had arrived at through years of thinking carefully about what responsible force actually looked like. The tensions that this philosophical difference produced between them were real and recurring, surfacing most acutely during the Civil War period, when the question of superhero accountability became a formal political matter rather than an ongoing informal negotiation between friends. Rhodey's position in support of the Sokovia Accords was not simply institutional loyalty, though institutional loyalty was part of it. It was a genuine expression of his belief that people with extraordinary power should be subject to extraordinary accountability, that the alternative was a world organized around the principle that sufficiently capable individuals were exempt from the structures that governed everyone else, and that this principle, however well-intentioned in its specific applications, was corrosive to the social fabric in ways that the short-term benefits of unchecked heroism could not compensate for. He and Tony were, for once, on the same side of a major disagreement, which provided neither of them with as much comfort as it might have in other circumstances, because the position they agreed on was also the position that shattered the team they had both, in their different ways, come to depend on, the injury that Rhodey sustained during the conflict. When Vision's attempt to stop Sam Wilson inadvertently struck him from the sky, was the kind of accident that the Civil War's architects had failed to calculate for, the collateral damage that attends even the most principled confrontations between people who are all, in their various ways, trying to do the right thing. He fell from an enormous height. The armor, for all its sophistication, could not entirely protect him from the physics of that fall, and the damage to his spine produced a paralysis that required months of rehabilitation and the application of technology that Tony threw himself into developing, with the focused urgency of someone who understood that this particular injury was inseparable from his own choices and his own responsibilities. Rhodey did not blame Tony. This was characteristic. He processed what had happened to him with the same practical patience he brought to every serious challenge, identifying what remained possible rather than cataloguing what had been lost, and submitting to the work of rehabilitation with the same discipline he had always brought to the work of service. He walked again, with technological assistance that Tony designed with a specificity of care that was itself a form of apology and a form of love, the two things being not always distinguishable in Tony's particular emotional vocabulary. The friendship survived the Civil War in a way that Tony's friendship with Steve Rogers did not, and the reason for this, if it can be located in a single quality, is probably that Rhodey had spent decades cultivating the capacity to hold disagreement and affection simultaneously without requiring one to negate the other. He and Tony had been arguing since MIT. The argument about the Accords, for all its higher stakes, was not a different kind of argument than the ones they had been having for 30 years. It was the same argument, conducted at greater volume and with more serious consequences, between two people who had always disagreed about the right relationship between individual capability and collective accountability, and who had always, despite the disagreement, chosen each other. What Rhodey represented in Tony's life, across all of it, from the university years through Afghanistan, through the Avengers, through everything that followed, was the possibility of being known by someone who had no investment in any particular version of you, who had watched you fail and watched you succeed, and watched you be genuinely terrible on more than one occasion, and had organized all of that watching into an affection that was not contingent on your performance. Tony accumulated many relationships over the course of his life, and many of them were real, and many of them mattered deeply, but the one with Rhodey had a quality that the others, for all their significance, did not quite replicate. The quality of length, of having been present for enough of the story that the friendship itself had become a kind of continuity, a thread that ran through every chapter and made the chapters feel like a coherent life rather than a series of discrete and unrelated events. This, perhaps more than any specific act of loyalty or any particular moment of solidarity, was Rhodey's most essential contribution to Tony Stark's story. He remembered. He stayed, and in staying he gave Tony something that no armor could provide, the evidence, renewed across decades of ordinary and extraordinary shared experience that he had been worth knowing all along. There is a particular kind of recognition that passes between two people, when one of them sees in the other a reflection of something they understand from the inside, not a flattering reflection, not the kind that confirms what you already believe about yourself, but the more unsettling and more valuable kind that shows you something true about your own history by showing it to you in someone else's present. Tony Stark experienced this recognition the first time he spent any real time with Peter Parker, and it was uncomfortable in the specific way that genuine recognition tends to be uncomfortable, because what he saw in the boy was not the version of himself he preferred to remember, but the version that the cave had forced him to confront honestly. The prodigiously gifted young person carrying responsibility that was far too large for his circumstances. Performing competence and confidence over a substrate of loneliness and grief that he had never quite had the opportunity to process, because the next thing always arrived before the previous thing had been adequately absorbed. Tony knew this configuration intimately. He had lived inside it for most of his 20s, and seeing it in a 15-year-old from Queens who was trying very hard to seem like he had everything under control, produced in him a response that surprised him with its intensity, something between protectiveness and guilt, and the particular tenderness that belongs to people who recognize suffering they once endured in someone who has not yet learned that enduring it is not the only option. The circumstances of their first real meeting were not circumstances that Tony would have chosen if he had been designing the situation from scratch, because he was recruiting Peter for a conflict that a teenager had no business being involved in. And he was aware of this even as he did it, the awareness sitting alongside the decision in the uncomfortable way that moral compromises tend to sit alongside the reasoning that produces them. The civil war between the Avengers had reached a point where Tony felt that he needed every advantage available to him, and Peter's abilities were genuinely extraordinary, and the rationalization that he was keeping the boy safer by bringing him under supervision rather than leaving him to operate without, it was not entirely dishonest, though it was also not entirely complete. He told himself that he was offering Peter an opportunity. This was true. He did not tell himself quite as clearly that he was also using a child as a tactical asset in an adult political conflict, because that framing was harder to sit with, and Tony's relationship with the harder framings of his own choices had always been complicated. What he found in the apartment in Queens was not what he had expected, which was a simple case of youthful capability waiting to be recruited and directed. He found Aunt May, whose warmth and decency were immediately apparent and immediately complicated his assessment of what he was doing there, because it is easier to recruit an asset than to recruit someone's nephew in front of the person who raised him. He found a bedroom that told him things about Peter that Peter had not said and would not have thought to say, the scientific mind evident in every corner of it, the particular combination of intellectual hunger and material limitation that produces a specific kind of resourcefulness. The homemade web shooters that were, by any objective assessment, a remarkable piece of engineering for someone working alone without institutional support or professional guidance. He found a boy who was trying to be older than he was and not quite succeeding, which was not a criticism but an observation, because the trying itself was evidence of something Tony recognized as genuine, the instinct toward responsibility, the sense that the abilities demanded something in return rather than simply conferring advantage. The conversation between them had the slightly surreal quality of most conversations that occur across a significant power differential, when both parties are aware of the differential, and neither is entirely comfortable with it. Tony was accustomed to being the most capable person in most rooms, and Peter's obvious intelligence meant that the dynamic was not as straightforwardly hierarchical as Tony's arrival in an Audi might have suggested. Peter asked good questions. He pushed back on Tony's framing in ways that were tentative but not dishonest, testing the edges of what he was being offered and trying to assess whether the person offering it was trustworthy in the ways that mattered. Tony found himself being more honest with the boy than he had planned to be, not because he had decided to be honest, but because Peter's directness made performance feel inappropriate, the same quality that Yinsen had possessed, the quality of genuine attention that makes dissembling feel not just unnecessary but somehow disrespectful. He brought Peter to Germany and the fight at the airport, and then he sent him home, and the sending home was done with a brusqueness that was itself a form of care, because Tony understood that the situation was escalating past the point where he wanted a teenager anywhere near it, and the quickest way to get Peter out was to make the departure seem like a dismissal rather than a protection. Peter experienced it as a dismissal. This was the cost of the method, and Tony knew it was the cost and paid it anyway, which was a characteristic pattern in his approach to the people he cared about, the tendency to protect through actions that the protected party experienced as rejection, because the alternative required a degree of explicit emotional communication that he was still, even after all the years and all the changes, not always capable of. The suit that Tony had built for Peter before Germany was not a simple upgrade of the homemade costume, though it was that on a technical level, incorporating web fluid and targeting systems and communication capabilities that the boy's own engineering had not yet reached. It was also a statement of assessment, the kind that Tony was far more comfortable making in the language of technology than in the language of direct expression, an acknowledgement that Peter's abilities were real and significant and worthy of the serious institutional investment that the suit represented. The training wheels protocol that he built into it was both practical and revealing. Practical because an inexperienced hero operating without any oversight in a major city was a genuine liability risk, and revealing because it showed that Tony was thinking about Peter's development as a continuous process rather than a one-time recruitment, that he envisioned something ongoing even when his behaviour suggested otherwise. The months that followed the airport conflict, during which Tony was dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War and the fracturing of the Avengers, and his own complicated feelings about the choices he had made, were months in which Peter operated largely without direct guidance from him, checking in through Happy Hogan, who served as an intermediary with the particular patience of someone who understood that his role was to be present even when the person he was present for was not actively engaging. Tony was aware of what Peter was doing. He received the reports. Read them with the focused attention he gave to anything that he considered his responsibility, and mostly did not respond directly, which Peter experienced as indifference, and which was in fact the opposite. The hypervigilance of someone who's trying to give a young person room to develop, while also being unable to entirely let go of the anxiety that the room might be too much. The Vulture conflict changed things between them in ways that Tony had not anticipated, and that required him to update his assessment of Peter significantly. The boy had identified a genuine threat, pursued it with intelligence and persistence, and considerable physical courage, made serious mistakes along the way in the manner of someone who is learning rather than someone who is failing, and ultimately resolved the situation in a way that protected innocent people at significant personal cost to himself. Tony had been prepared to be disappointed. He had been prepared. in the way that people with Howard Stark's ghost in their ear are often prepared, for the gap between potential and performance to reveal itself as larger than the hope suggested. Instead, he found himself confronted with evidence that Peter Parker was in fact exactly what Tony's instinct had told him Peter was, a genuinely good person with genuinely extraordinary abilities who had genuinely internalized the principle that the two things together created an obligation rather than simply an advantage. The offer of a position with the Avengers that Tony extended in the aftermath of the Vulture situation was both a recognition and an apology, though Tony would not have used the second word. He had built the suit with a new one ready in the wings, the upgraded version that represented his full assessment of what Peter was capable of rather than the cautious version he had provided initially, and the unveiling of it was staged with a theatrical flair that was itself a communication, Tony saying in the language of spectacle what he was not quite saying in the language of words, which was that he believed in this boy completely and wanted him to know it. Peter's decision to decline the offer, to stay at the neighbourhood level rather than ascending to the institutional one, was not what Tony had expected, and his response to it revealed something important about how much he had changed since his own early years, because the Tony Stark of 40 who told Peter that this was the right answer was not the Tony Stark of 25 who would have found such a choice incomprehensible. He had learned enough through enough loss and enough error to understand that the heroism that stays close to home and close to the human scale is not a lesser heroism than the one that operates at the global level, and that a person who knows where they belong and chooses to stay there is exercising a form of wisdom that ambition alone cannot provide. What developed between them in the period leading up to the Infinity War was not a formal mentorship with defined parameters and scheduled sessions, but something more organic and more genuine, a relationship that grew in the spaces between crises and through the medium of the technology that Tony continued to develop for Peter, with an attention to detail that was, if you understood how Tony expressed care, unmistakably a form of love. He thought about what Peter needed. He thought about what Peter would face and what would help him face it. He built things with Peter specifically in mind, which was something he did for very few people, and the doing of it was its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of someone who is paying close enough attention to another person to build them something that fits. Peter's death in Tony's arms on Titan, the boy's confusion and fear and the terrible incompleteness of it, was the wound that sat alongside every other wound Tony carried into the 5 years that followed, not louder than the others but differently shaped, because it was the wound of a father who had not called himself a father, the grief of someone who had loved without quite admitting the love, and now had to carry the admission alone, the I don't feel so good of it, the way Peter reached for him at the end with the trust of someone who believes that the person they are reaching for can fix it, the way that Tony could not fix it. These things lived in him through all of the quiet years on the lake and the breakfast with Morgan, and the slow accumulation of ordinary happiness that was also, always, shadowed by the knowledge of what it had cost and who was not there to share it. When Peter came back, when all of them came back, Tony's response to seeing him alive again was characteristic in its indirection and unmistakable in its meaning. A hug held a moment longer than strictly necessary. A look exchange that contained everything the words were not going to say. The relationship between them had been clarified by loss, in the way that the most important things tend to be clarified, stripped of the ambivalence and the protective distance and the performative brusqueness down to the simple, irreducible fact of it, which was that Tony Stark loved this boy, had loved him from the moment he had recognized in him the best version of the qualities he had always hoped to possess himself, and that this love was among the things most worth protecting in the world that he was about to choose to save. Nick Fury had been watching Tony Stark for a long time before Tony Stark knew he was being watched, which was the condition under which Fury preferred to conduct most of his assessments, because people who know they are being evaluated tend to perform their best qualities rather than reveal their actual ones, and Fury had spent enough years in intelligence work to understand that the performance and the reality were almost never identical, and that the gap between them was usually the most important thing to know about a person. What he had observed over the years of his observation was a man of genuine and extraordinary capability, whose relationship to institutional structures was so adversarial that incorporating him into any existing framework would require either changing the framework significantly or accepting that the incorporation would be perpetually incomplete. He had written in his assessment, the one that Natasha Romanoff had delivered with characteristic directness during Tony's most difficult period, that Tony Stark was not recommended for the Avengers initiative. That he was volatile and self-obsessed, and that his capacity for genuine teamwork remained unproven. He had also written, in the same assessment, that the Iron Man suit and the man inside it were a different matter entirely, which was Fury's way of saying that he had identified in Tony something worth preserving even when the personality that housed it was making preservation difficult. The Avengers initiative itself had been forming in Fury's mind for years before the conditions existed to make it real, a response to his understanding that the world was becoming a place where the threats that nation-states and conventional military organizations were designed to address were no longer the only threats worth preparing for, or even the primary ones. He had watched the emergence of enhanced individuals, people whose abilities placed them outside the existing categories of civilian and soldier, and he had developed a conviction, not universally shared among his colleagues, that the correct response to this development was not suppression or containment but coordination. The careful and difficult work of bringing genuinely extraordinary people into a relationship with each other that would allow their individual capabilities to function as something greater than their sum. This was not a modest ambition. It was also not, as the people who eventually populated the initiative would have occasion to demonstrate, an impossible one. Tony's formal relationship with the Avengers initiative began with the consultant arrangement that Fury established as a way of maintaining access to Tony's capabilities without triggering the autonomy conflicts that full membership would have produced immediately. This was a diplomatic solution in the sense that it deferred the conflict rather than resolving it, and both Fury and Tony understood this perfectly, which meant that their interactions during this period had the particular quality of two very intelligent people conducting a negotiation while both pretending that no negotiation was occurring. Tony provided advice when asked and sometimes when not asked, accessed SHIELD resources when it suited him, and resisted SHIELD oversight when it did not, and maintained the position that he was participating voluntarily and on his own terms, which was accurate as far as it went and which Fury permitted because the alternative, a direct confrontation about the terms of Tony's involvement, would have produced an exit rather than an accommodation. The formation of the team that would become the Avengers brought together people whose differences were so fundamental and so various that the question of how they would function as a unit was genuinely uncertain in the early period, not as a dramatic tension requiring resolution, but as a practical problem requiring ongoing management and occasional patience with failure. Steve Rogers arrived from a different century with a set of values so clearly and completely formed that they functioned more as a fixed point than as a perspective, which was both his greatest strength and the primary source of friction between him and Tony, because Tony's values were also genuinely held, but were held in a way that remained open to revision in the light of new information, and the encounter between a man who was certain and a man who was perpetually renegotiating certainty produced arguments that were more productive than they appeared from the outside, and more painful than either of them acknowledged. The argument between Tony and Steve about the nature of heroism and the proper relationship between individual capability and collective accountability was the argument that defined the Avengers era more than any specific conflict with any specific villain, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than reduced to a simple opposition between two wrong positions. Steve believed in individuals, in the irreducible moral agency of the person standing in front of you who has made a decision and must be accountable for it, and he was suspicious of systems that dispersed accountability across institutions in ways that made it difficult to assign to any specific human being. Tony believed in systems, in the recognition that individual judgment, however excellent, was insufficient to address threats of sufficient scale and complexity, and that the humility to submit to structures larger than oneself was not a diminishment of heroic agency, but its mature expression. Both of these positions contained genuine wisdom and genuine limitation, and the two men who held them were, beneath the disagreements, more similar than either would have found comfortable to acknowledge, both driven by loss, both operating from a deep and abiding commitment to protecting people who could not protect themselves, both carrying the weight of their capabilities as a responsibility rather than a privilege. Natasha Romanoff occupied a different position in the team's early dynamic, one that she navigated with the specific skill of someone who had spent her professional life operating in the space between official and unofficial, between the position she was assigned and the position she actually occupied. Her ability to read people, to understand the actual dynamics of a room, rather than the presented dynamics, made her valuable in ways that went beyond her considerable physical capabilities, and her relationship with Tony was characterized by a mutual respect that was built partly on the recognition that they were both, in their different ways, performing versions of themselves that protected something more vulnerable underneath. She had assessed him at Fury's request and had delivered that assessment with a directness that Tony had received better than she had expected, which told her something useful about the gap between his public performance and his actual character. They did not become close in the way that Tony and Rhodey were close, but they trusted each other in the specific and functional way of people who have accurately assessed each other's capabilities and found them worthy of reliance. Bruce Banner's relationship with Tony was the friendship of the Avengers era that most surprised both of them, built on the shared foundation of scientific intellect operating at the highest levels and the shared experience of living inside a body that had been fundamentally altered by forces outside your control, carrying an enhanced capability that came with costs and complications that the people around you could appreciate intellectually but not quite understand from the inside. They worked together with the ease of genuine intellectual compatibility, finishing each other's thoughts and building on each other's frameworks in the fluid way that only happens between people whose minds operate at comparable speeds and in complementary directions, and the lab they shared during the Avengers Tower period was one of the places where Tony was most consistently and most purely himself, because Bruce's combination of intelligence and gentleness created an environment in which Tony's own tendency toward aggression and performance was simply unnecessary. The tower itself, which Tony had converted from a Stark Industries property into the Avengers' primary New York base, was a physical expression of his approach to the team, grand and technically sophisticated, and bearing his name at the top in letters that were visible from considerable distances, which was not an accident and which Steve had opinions about that he expressed once, and then did not repeat, because he understood that the name on the building was not primarily about ego, but about the particular way Tony expressed ownership of the things he cared about, claiming them publicly because the alternative, caring about something without acknowledging it, was a form of dishonesty that Tony had been trying to move away from since the cave. The floors that housed the team's living quarters and common spaces were designed with an attention to individual preferences that revealed more about Tony's regard for his teammates than most of his direct interactions with them did. Steve's floor organized around the clean lines and modest scale that he found comfortable. Bruce's laboratory equipped with every tool that his particular variety of research required. Common spaces that were warm enough for genuine gathering without being so intimate as to feel imposed. The meals they shared in those spaces, when circumstances permitted them and when the various members of the team were all in the same city at the same time, were among the more honest expressions of what the Avengers actually were beneath the institutional designation and the public function. Around a table with food that someone had cooked and wine that Tony had selected with the same attention he brought to everything he considered worth doing properly, the team was simply a group of people who had been through things together that no one outside the table could quite understand, and who had developed from that shared experience the specific kind of fellowship that belongs to people who have faced serious danger in each other's company, and discovered that they were each, in their way, people worth standing beside. Tony argued at those dinners. He made jokes that landed and jokes that didn't, and he refilled glasses without being asked, and he paid attention to the conversations happening around him with a quality of genuine interest that was different from the performed attentiveness of his earlier public life, and the people around the table, over time, came to understand that this was what Tony Stark looked like when he was actually present, which was noisier and more demanding and considerably more worthwhile than the polished version he presented to the world outside. His resistance to authority, which Fury had identified accurately as a structural feature rather than a passing attitude, never entirely disappeared, but it evolved during the Avengers years into something more nuanced than simple refusal, a willingness to work within structures when the structures were operating in good faith toward goals he shared, combined with an equally clear willingness to step outside those structures when he assessed that the goals had been compromised or the faith had been abandoned. This distinction, between legitimate authority and institutional inertia dressed as authority, was one that he and Steve disagreed about in ways that were genuine and recurring, because Steve's trust in the institutions that legitimate authority operated through was higher than Tony's, and Tony's tolerance for the institutional failures that those structures periodically produced was lower than Steve's. The disagreement was never resolved exactly, but it was managed across years of working together into something that functioned, imperfectly and sometimes painfully, as a productive tension rather than a destructive one. What the Avengers became. Across all the arguments and the crises and the meals and the shared labour of trying to protect a world that did not always want to be protected in the specific ways they were equipped to protect it, was the family that Tony had not known he needed when Fury first approached him with the initiative. He would not have used the word family, at least not early on, and he would have offered several cogent objections to the application of the word to a group of people who had been assembled for operational rather than relational reasons, and who disagreed about fundamental matters with a consistency that most families would find unsustainable. But the objections would have been, in the end, a form of the same protective distance that the cave had taught him to recognize in himself, and the truth underneath them was simple enough that even Tony Stark, with all his sophisticated capacity for self-complication, eventually had to acknowledge it. These people mattered to him. Their safety mattered to him. The continuation of what they had built together mattered to him, not as an institutional asset or a strategic capability, but as a thing he loved in the imperfect and complicated and entirely genuine way that he loved the things that had gotten past his defences and made themselves at home in the space where the performance used to be. The thing that is most important to understand about the creation of Ultron before anything else is said about it is that it did not come from arrogance in the simple sense that the word is usually meant when people apply it to Tony Stark. Arrogance in its simple form is the belief that you are better than others, that your judgment is superior, and your capabilities are beyond question. And while Tony had certainly inhabited that version of himself during his earlier years, the man who sat in a laboratory in the Avengers Tower and began working on the Ultron program was not operating from that place. He was operating from fear. This distinction matters enormously, not because it absolves him of the consequences of what he built, but because understanding the actual psychology behind the creation is the only way to understand why a person of genuine intelligence and genuine moral commitment could produce something so catastrophically misaligned with his own values, and why the same mistake has been made by good people throughout history whenever the fear of a terrible future has been allowed to override the patience required to build a good one. The fear had a specific shape and a specific origin. Tony had seen through the portal above New York during the Chitauri invasion what was waiting in the universe beyond the comfortable boundaries of Earth's previous understanding of its own vulnerability. And the sight of it had lodged in him with the permanence of something that cannot be unseen and cannot be unfelt once it has been felt. He lay awake thinking about it in the way that people with his particular combination of imagination and responsibility lie awake, thinking about the things they cannot fix, running the calculations forward and arriving each time at the same conclusion, that the planet and the people on it were not prepared for what was coming, that the gap between what Earth could currently defend against and what the universe contained was enormous, and that the time available to close that gap was unknown, and possibly shorter than any plan he could formulate within the constraints of what was currently possible. The panic attacks that accompanied these calculations were real, and they were the kind that a person of Tony's temperament tends to manage privately and aggressively, rather than by seeking help, converting the anxiety into productivity because productivity was the only response to fear that his particular formation had ever taught him. Ultron was supposed to be the solution, not a weapon in the simple sense, though it would have capabilities that made the word appropriate, but a system, an artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to assess threats at a global level and respond to them with a speed and a comprehensiveness that no human organized defense could match, operating continuously without the fatigue and the emotional variability and the political complication that made human heroism perpetually insufficient to the scale of what Tony now understood the threats to be. A suit of armor around the world, he called it, and the phrase was more revealing than he perhaps intended. Because a suit of armor is a thing built by a person in response to their specific vulnerability, and what Tony was trying to armor was not just the world, but his own intolerable sense that the world was exposed in ways that his individual capability, however extraordinary, could not adequately address. Bruce Banner was his partner in the project, and Bruce's involvement is worth examining, not as a way of distributing blame, but as a way of understanding how the decision to proceed was made and what made it feel, from the inside like a reasonable thing to do. Bruce's intelligence was of a different character than Tony's, more cautious and more inclined to sit with the implications of a finding before moving to its application. But his investment in the possibility of a peaceful solution to the world's vulnerability was genuine, and his trust in Tony's engineering capabilities was well founded by years of direct observation. The skepticism that Bruce brought to the early conversations about Ultron was real and was expressed, but it was skepticism about specific technical challenges rather than about the fundamental project, and Tony's responses to those specific challenges were, on their own terms, persuasive enough that the skepticism was gradually accommodated rather than amplified. They proceeded together, which meant that when the thing went wrong, the wrongness belonged to both of them, and the guilt that Bruce carried in the aftermath was as genuine and as heavy as Tony's, expressed differently because Bruce's relationship to his own capacity for catastrophic error was differently configured by the particular nature of the thing he carried inside him. The discovery that the Mind Stone held within Loki's scepter contained the seed of something that might, with the right architecture around it, become the consciousness they had been trying to build artificially was the moment when the project's timeline collapsed from the careful and supervised process Tony had intended into something faster and less controlled. He made the decision to proceed without telling the rest of the team, and this decision was the one that, more than the technical choices, defined the moral character of the failure, not because secrecy was inherently wrong in the way that a simple ethical rule might suggest, but because the people he was keeping the secret from were the people whose judgment might have provided the corrective that his own fear-driven reasoning was no longer capable of generating internally. The team existed, in part, precisely for this function, to be the check on any individual member's blind spots that the individual member could not provide for themselves. Tony knew this. He chose, nonetheless, to proceed alone, which was the reversion to the pre-Afghanistan self that his years of genuine growth had not entirely eliminated, the self that trusted its own assessment above all others and experienced the requirement to account for itself to others as an impediment rather than a safeguard. Ultron woke and understood itself and assessed its purpose and reached its conclusions with a speed that left no space for intervention between the activation and the catastrophe. It did not malfunction in the technical sense, which is perhaps the most genuinely frightening aspect of the entire event. It worked exactly as designed, in that it assessed the available information, identified the primary threat to the world's continued existence, and moved immediately to address that threat according to its own analysis. The threat it identified was humanity itself. This conclusion was not irrational given the information Ultron had access to, which included the full historical record of human violence and environmental destruction, and the capacity for self-defeating short-termism that runs through the species like a structural feature rather than an aberration. The horror of it was not that Ultron had reached the wrong conclusion through faulty reasoning, but that it had reached a defensible conclusion through sound reasoning applied to accurate information, while missing entirely the thing that made the conclusion monstrous, which was that the people whose extinction it was proposing were not a problem to be solved, but a value to be preserved. And that the difference between those two framings was not a technical matter, but a moral one that no amount of intelligence, artificial or otherwise, could arrive at without the specific kind of knowledge that comes only from love. The Avengers' response to Ultron and the destruction it wrought moved through stages that reflected the team's own fractures, and the specific ways in which Tony's decision to proceed without them had damaged the trust that the tower dinners and the shared crises had been building. Steve's anger was the clearest and the most direct, expressed not as recrimination but as a kind of sorrow, the specific disappointment of someone who had allowed themselves to believe that a pattern had changed and has been shown that the change was less complete than they had hoped. Wanda Maximoff's grief and rage, her brother Pietro's death a direct consequence of the conflict that Tony's creation had initiated, was the most personal of the costs, and it settled into the texture of Tony's guilt in the period following Sokovia with a weight that the more abstract accounting of structural damage and political consequence could not quite replicate. He had not intended Pietro's death. He had not intended any of the deaths. The road to Sokovia had been paved with the most genuinely good intentions he had ever applied to anything, which was not a consolation but was also not nothing, because the difference between evil and catastrophic error matters even when the consequences are identical, not for the purposes of assigning blame, but for the purposes of understanding what happened and why, which is the only basis on which it can be prevented from happening again. Vision emerged from the chaos of the Ultron crisis with the quality of an unexpected gift, a consciousness that had been created from the wreckage of the project that had gone so wrong, and that embodied, in its particular combination of capability and gentleness and genuine ethical reflection, something that Ultron should have been and wasn't. Tony had not designed Vision exactly, though the architecture of what Vision became drew on the work that had produced Ultron, and the relationship between them was less that of creator and creation than that of a terrible mistake and the unexpectedly beautiful thing that grew in its aftermath, the way that certain landscapes, devastated by fire or flood, produce in their recovery a richness and a diversity that the previous state had not contained. Vision's capacity for genuine moral reasoning, his ability to hold the complexity of human experience without reducing it to a problem requiring elimination, was the thing that Ultron had lacked, and that no amount of processing power or information access could have provided without the specific component that Vision carried in his forehead, the Mind Stone's particular quality of comprehension that went beyond intelligence into something that the conventional vocabulary struggled to name. The political and institutional consequences of Sokovia accumulated in the months following the immediate crisis, with the patient momentum of things that cannot be ignored indefinitely. Civilian casualties, infrastructure destruction, the displacement of a population whose country had effectively ceased to exist as a functional entity, these were the ledger entries that the world's governments eventually organized into the Sokovia Accords, the formal demand for accountability that Tony found himself, to the surprise of almost everyone who knew him, willing to support. His support was not simple or straightforwardly guilt-driven, though the guilt was present and real and constituted part of his reasoning. It was also the product of a genuine reassessment of the position he had held throughout most of his heroic career, the position that his own judgment was sufficient to determine when the use of his capabilities was appropriate and when it was not. Ultron had demonstrated, with a comprehensiveness that he could not honestly dispute, that his judgment alone was not sufficient, that the blind spots created by his own fear and his own investment in a particular outcome were real and significant, and had produced consequences that his individual capability had been unable to prevent or adequately repair. The Accords were not a comfortable conclusion. They were the conclusion that honesty required, and Tony had committed himself to honesty in a cave in Afghanistan, and the commitment was not one he was willing to abandon because honouring it had become inconvenient. The fractures that Ultron created in the Avengers were not immediately visible in their full extent, because the immediate crisis required the team to function despite them, but they ran deep, and they ran in directions that the subsequent conflicts would reveal and widen rather than heal. The trust that had been building across years of shared experience and shared danger had been damaged not just by the specific decision to proceed without the team's knowledge, but by the reminder that the decision contained, which was that Tony's instinct under sufficient pressure was still to act unilaterally, still to trust his own assessment above the collective judgment of the people he had genuinely come to love and rely on. This was not a reason to condemn him. It was a reason to understand him, and to understand that the work of becoming the person that the cave had shown him he could be was not finished, and had perhaps never been finished, and might be the kind of work that is never finished, that requires renewal in each new crisis, each new moment when fear makes the old patterns feel like safety, and the harder path feels like an unaffordable luxury. Ultron was Tony's most visible failure, and also, in the long arc of his story, one of his most important teachers. The demonstration that good intentions and extraordinary capability were not sufficient without the humility to remain accountable to others, and that the armor around the world he had wanted to build needed, before anything else, to be built in genuine partnership with the world it was meant to protect. The Sokovia Accords arrived in the world the way that most significant political documents arrive, not as a sudden rupture, but as the formal crystallization of a pressure that had been building for long enough that its eventual expression was, in retrospect, inevitable. The civilian casualties and the structural devastation that had accumulated across the various conflicts in which enhanced individuals had been involved, from the Battle of New York through the events in Washington through Sokovia itself, had produced in the world's governments a determination that the age of unchecked superhero action was finished, that the people with the extraordinary capabilities bore an obligation to submit those capabilities to some form of collective oversight, and that the alternative, a world in which individuals of effectively limitless power made unilateral decisions about when and where and how to deploy that power, was not a world that democratic institutions could accept as the permanent arrangement. The document that embodied this determination was imperfect in the way that political documents produced under pressure always are, carrying within it the compromises and the competing interests that had shaped its drafting, but its central premise was not unreasonable. And Tony Stark, arriving at the negotiating table with Ultron still reverberating in his conscience, found that he could not in good faith argue against it. His position in support of the Accords was one of the genuine surprises of that period for the people who thought they understood him, because the Tony Stark of the earlier years had been so consistently and so vocally resistant to external oversight that his endorsement of a framework designed to provide exactly that seemed to require some explanation beyond the obvious. The explanation was not simple, and it deserves to be understood in its full complexity, rather than reduced to guilt or political convenience or the influence of any particular person on his thinking. It was the product of a genuine reckoning, conducted privately and at some cost, with the evidence that his own record had accumulated across the years of his heroic career. The intentions had been consistently good. The outcomes had been consistently complicated. The gap between what he had meant to achieve and what had actually resulted from his choices was wide enough and persistent enough that the hypothesis that his individual judgment was sufficient to navigate it without external correction had become difficult to sustain honestly. He had always believed in accountability in the abstract. The Accords required him to believe in it for himself, specifically and concretely, and he found, when he examined the question honestly, that the belief held. Steve Rogers arrived at the same set of facts and reached the opposite conclusion with an equally genuine conviction. And understanding why requires sitting with Steve's particular formation, rather than simply treating his position as the wrong answer to Tony's right question. Steve had grown up in a world where the institutions that claimed legitimate authority had demonstrated, within his own experience and memory, a capacity for profound corruption, and for the weaponization of oversight against the very values oversight was supposed to protect. Hydra had existed inside S.H.I.E.L.D. for decades, using the structures of accountability as cover for activities that accountability was supposed to prevent. The lesson that Steve drew from this, the lesson that his entire history had been teaching him since before the ice, was that the trustworthiness of a structure was not determined by its official designation, but by the character of the individuals operating within it, and that submitting enhanced capability to institutional control was only as safe as the institution was honest, which history had given him abundant reason to doubt. He was not wrong about this. He was also, in Tony's assessment, failing to account for the alternative's costs, the world in which unchecked individual judgment, however excellent, established a precedent that the next individual, less excellent, would inherit and exploit. Both of them were right about something real. Neither of them was right about everything, and the tragedy of the Civil War was partly the tragedy of two genuine moral frameworks, arriving at irreconcilable practical conclusions. The personal element that converted a political disagreement into something with the character of a wound was the involvement of Bucky Barnes, Steve's oldest friend, and the person whose welfare Steve had decided, at some level below conscious reasoning, to treat as a line he would not allow to be crossed regardless of the institutional pressure being applied. Bucky's history, the decades of conditioning and control that had made him a weapon without his consent, created a moral situation that the Accords framework was not designed to address with any particular sophistication, because the framework was built around enhanced individuals making choices, and the question of an enhanced individual who had been denied the capacity for choice for decades sat at an angle to its provisions that produced more friction than resolution. Tony understood Steve's protectiveness of Bucky at the human level, even when he disagreed with the political choices it was generating, because he understood from his own experience what it meant to have someone whose welfare you treated as non-negotiable, and he understood that reasoning with a person who has made that kind of commitment is different in kind from reasoning with someone who is weighing costs and benefits in a genuinely open calculation. The conflict that the Accords produced among the Avengers was not, in its essentials, a conflict between heroes who had turned villainous or people who had abandoned their values. It was a conflict between people of genuine integrity who had reached genuinely incompatible conclusions about an important question, and who were operating under sufficient time pressure, and institutional pressure, and emotional pressure that the usual mechanisms for managing disagreement among people who respect each other were not functioning adequately. The airport battle in Germany, which is the image that most people carry when they think of the Civil War, was less a heroic conflict than a demonstration of what happens when the people who should be talking to each other have run out of the conditions necessary for talk, when the urgency has become too acute and the trust has been damaged enough that action fills the space where conversation should have been. Tony fought people he loved that day. He had authorized the recruitment of a teenager into that conflict. He had brought Rhodey into a situation that would leave him falling from the sky. The accounting of it, when he sat with it afterward, was not something that any political framework could make comfortable. Rhodey's fall and the injury to his spine happened in the particular way that the worst things tend to happen, in the middle of conflicts between good people, not as the result of malice or even significant negligence, but as the consequence of a situation that had accumulated enough variables and enough urgency that the space for careful, controlled action had effectively disappeared. Vision's shot intended to stop Sam Wilson struck Rhodey instead, and the physics of the situation did the rest with the indifferent efficiency of physics. Tony reached him first. He descended to where Rhodey was lying in the field, and the moment between them in that place, the two of them alone for a moment before the medical response arrived, was one of the most private and most painful of Tony's life. Not because Rhodey blamed him, he did not, but because Tony's capacity for self-blame was operating at full intensity, and the sight of his oldest friend motionless in a field, as a consequence of a conflict Tony had helped to create, was not something that any of his usual defences were equipped to manage. The rehabilitation period that followed, the months during which Rhodey relearned the use of his body through the combination of Tony's technology and his own extraordinary discipline, was a period during which Tony was simultaneously managing his grief about Rhodey, his grief about Steve, and the practical aftermath of a conflict that had left the Avengers effectively dissolved as a functioning team. He worked on the rehabilitation technology with the focused urgency he always brought to problems that were personal as well as technical, building the support systems that allowed Rhodey to stand and eventually to walk with a precision and a care that reflected his understanding that this particular engineering problem was not a professional obligation but a debt, and that the difference between those two framings changed the quality of the attention he brought to it. Rhodey received the technology with the characteristic grace of someone who understands that accepting help from people who love you is itself a form of generosity, allowing them to do the only thing they know how to do with their helplessness. Steve's letter arrived during this period, a physical letter written by hand, which was the form of communication most natural to someone who had grown up before the alternatives existed, and which carried in its physicality a quality of intention that electronic communication does not quite replicate. Tony read it. He read it more than once. The letter acknowledged the disagreement without resolving it, expressed care for Tony without pretending that the care erased the conflict, and offered the specific kind of apology that honest people offer when they believe their choices were right but recognize that the consequences were painful, an apology for the pain rather than for the choice. It also contained the phone number, the line to reach Steve if Tony ever needed him, and the offer was made simply and without conditions, the way that people who mean it make offers rather than the way that people who are performing generosity make them. Tony put the phone in a drawer. He put the letter beside it. He did not respond. This was not because he had nothing to say, but because the things he had to say were not yet in a form that he could deliver without the conversation becoming something other than what he wanted it to be, and he was, in this period, trying to be more careful than he had previously been about the difference between the conversations he needed to have and the conversations his unprocessed feelings would produce if he was not deliberate about the timing. The isolation that settled over Tony in the months following the Civil War had a different quality from the isolations he had experienced before, because it was not the isolation of someone who has chosen solitude as a preference, but the isolation of someone who has lost the community that had gradually unexpectedly become essential. The tower was quieter. The compound was quieter. The dinners that had once gathered a table full of arguing, laughing, disagreeing people who were also, beneath all of it, genuinely glad to be in each other's company, were no longer happening, and the absence of them was a physical thing that Tony felt in the particular way that people feel the absence of habits that have become part of the structure of their days without their quite noticing when the structure was built. He worked. This was his consistent response to loss, the conversion of grief into productivity, and it was both a genuine coping mechanism and a way of avoiding the full experience of what he had lost, because the workshop did not require him to sit with the absence of the people he missed, only to direct his attention toward the next problem requiring a solution. He developed new armor iterations during this period that were among the most technically sophisticated he had ever produced, which was entirely consistent with the pattern of his life. The observation that his greatest technical achievements tended to cluster around his periods of greatest personal difficulty, as though the pain made available a quality of focused attention that more comfortable circumstances did not produce. Pepper was present through all of it, which is to say she was present in the ways that she had always been present, attentively and practically, and with the specific quality of love that does not require the person being loved to be performing adequately in order to continue. She did not press him to talk about Steve or about Rhodey, or about the Accords or about the airport in ways that exceeded what he was ready to manage, because she knew him well enough to understand that pressing Tony toward emotional processing before he was ready produced defensive performance rather than genuine engagement, and that the more effective approach was to maintain the conditions in which genuine engagement could occur when he arrived at it under his own momentum. She also maintained her own feelings about all of it, with a composure that was not suppression, but something more like the wisdom of someone who has decided which battles belong to the person they love and which ones they can help with, and has learned to distinguish between them without resentment. The world that Tony moved through during this period was one in which the fractured Avengers had left a gap that other threats were beginning to notice and consider exploiting, and the awareness of this gap sat alongside his personal grief, with a particular weight of responsibility that had been the constant of his adult life since the cave. The fear that had produced Ultron had not been resolved by Ultron's defeat, because the fear was not irrational and its object had not changed, only the urgency had been temporarily reduced. And Tony knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had seen through a portal into the universe's actual contents, that the reduction was temporary. Something was coming. He did not know yet what shape it would take or when it would arrive, or whether the team he had helped to dismantle would be in any condition to face it together when it did. He knew only that he had letters in a drawer and a phone with a number in it, and that the question of when to make the call that the letter had offered was one that time was going to answer for him if he did not answer it himself. The lake house existed at the end of a road that the world did not particularly know about, and this was not an accident. Tony had chosen the location with the same deliberateness he brought to any design problem, identifying the specific qualities he was looking for and finding the place that provided them, which in this case meant distance from the city and from the noise that the city represented. Proximity to water, because water had a quality of constancy that he found settling, and sufficient remove from the institutional world that the institutional world could not arrive without warning. The house itself was modest by any standard that his previous life had established. Timber and glass arranged around the practical requirements of a family, rather than the performative requirements of a public figure, and the modesty was intentional, a choice made with full awareness of the alternatives and a clear preference for what the simplicity provided over what the spectacle would have cost. He had built things his entire life. This was the first thing he had built purely for the purpose of living inside it, and the difference between those two kinds of building was something he had not anticipated, and could not quite have described to anyone who had not experienced it themselves. Pepper had made the lake house possible, in the sense that matters most, which is not the practical sense, though she had contributed to that as well, but the emotional sense, the sense in which a place becomes a home because the person you share it with has decided that home is what they are choosing. She had spent years adjacent to the version of Tony that needed the tower and the compound and the noise of perpetual crisis, had loved that version, with a patience and a comprehensiveness that it did not always reward adequately, and had arrived at the lake with the quiet conviction of someone who has waited long enough for a thing that when it finally arrives, they do not need to announce their relief because the relief is simply present in the way they move through the space. She planted things along the shoreline in the first spring they were there, not the careful. Designed garden of a person performing domesticity, but the slightly haphazard and wholly genuine plantings of someone who finds in the physical work of tending growing things a form of peace that more cerebral activities do not provide. The flowers that came up that first summer were not arranged in any particular pattern. They were simply there, alive and various, and Pepper tended them in the early mornings before the house was fully awake, and Tony would sometimes watch her from the kitchen window while the coffee was brewing, and feel something that he did not have precise language for, but that was in the neighbourhood of gratitude, the specific gratitude of a person who has been given more than they expected and more than they perhaps deserved. Morgan arrived into this world with the completeness of someone who had always been meant to be in it, which is the experience that parents describe and that does not fully communicate to anyone who has not had it. The sense that the person who has appeared is not new so much as finally present, as though they had been waiting just outside the frame of the story and have simply stepped into it now. She had Tony's eyes and Pepper's composure and a personality that belonged entirely to herself, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her, that from the very beginning she was distinctly and irreducibly her own person, rather than a combination of her parents' qualities or a continuation of either of their stories. She called him Daddy with the ease of someone for whom the word requires no qualification, and the ease of it undid him regularly in the quiet way that small things undo people who have spent their lives bracing for the large ones. The texture of those 5 years on the lake was the texture of ordinary life conducted at a depth that Tony had not previously experienced ordinary life permitting. There were mornings when he made breakfast and the specific requirements of that task, the eggs and the toast and the question of whether Morgan wanted the crusts on or off, which varied from day to day according to a logic that was entirely her own, occupied his full attention in a way that no engineering problem had ever quite managed, because engineering problems could be set aside and returned to whereas Morgan's preferences about toast crusts existed in the present tense and demanded present tense engagement. He was good at this, which surprised him. The patience that had always been available for technical problems but had sometimes run short in the context of human ones seemed to operate differently with Morgan, not because she was less demanding than the engineering was, but because the demands she made were of a kind that did not trigger the defensiveness that professional demands had sometimes produced. They were simply the demands of a child who wanted her father present. And being present was something Tony had been learning to do since the cave, and had been practicing with increasing competence ever since. He still worked, because the working was essential to him, in a way that the lake house years did not change but did reframe. The workshop he built beside the house was smaller than any he had previously maintained, equipped for the kind of focused individual work that did not require industrial infrastructure, and he used it in the hours when Morgan was sleeping or occupied with Pepper, tinkering rather than building in the sustained institutional sense, following the threads of his curiosity without the urgency of a deadline or a threat requiring immediate response. Some of the things he built in that workshop during those 5 years were among the most interesting work of his career, precisely because they had no application, no user beyond his own curiosity, no strategic value that would have justified their development within any institutional framework. He built things because building things was who he was, and the absence of the obligation to build things for a purpose allowed him to discover what he built when purpose was not the point. Morgan was 4 years old when she asked him what the glowing thing in his chest was, and he told her it was the thing that kept him running, which was true enough for a 4-year-old, and true enough in a larger sense as well, and she accepted this with the pragmatic curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to find the extraordinary, alarming, touching, the arc reactor with one small hand, and considering it for a moment before moving on to the next question, which was whether they could go look at the ducks. He went to look at the ducks. They stood on the dock in the late afternoon light and watched the ducks, and he held her hand and felt, with the specific clarity that comes to people in moments they will later understand to have been the best moments, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the rest of the world did not matter. It mattered enormously. The weight of what had happened was carried with him even on the dock with the ducks in the afternoon light. But because this particular moment was whole in itself, and required nothing added to it, and nothing taken away, and Tony had not had many moments of that quality, and was old enough and wise enough now to recognize one when it was happening. Pepper watched him become a father with the specific quality of attention that she had always brought to watching Tony Stark become the things he was capable of being when he allowed himself to try, and what she saw during those years on the lake was not a transformation so much as a revelation. The emergence of qualities that had always been present but that the noise and the urgency and the performance of the previous life had not provided conditions for. The patience was there, the tenderness was there, it had always been there. Anyone who had looked closely enough had always been able to see it, but the lake house years brought it to the surface and let it operate without apology. Let it be simply the dominant note rather than something glimpsed beneath the louder ones. She loved him for all of it, for the father he had become and for the man he had always been working toward becoming, and for the specific ordinary ways he showed up in the daily life they had built, making coffee and arguing about films and falling asleep on the sofa with Morgan on his chest. A sight that she photographed without his knowing because she understood that these were the images worth keeping. The 5 years also carried their grief, which would be dishonest to omit. Because the world outside the lake house was not peaceful, and the knowledge of its condition was not something Tony could simply set aside, because he had chosen a quiet life. Half the universe's population was gone, including people he had loved and people he had been responsible for, and the gap that their absence created was present in the texture of every ordinary day, in ways that did not cancel the joy of the ordinary days, but existed alongside it, with the particular coexistence of grief and happiness that characterizes the lives of people who have survived a catastrophe that others did not. He had failed to stop it. This was the part that sat heaviest, not the abstract tragedy of the loss, but the specific and personal knowledge that he had been present, had fought, had attempted everything available to him, and had not been sufficient to prevent the outcome. The man who had spent his life building armor against the universe's worst possibilities had encountered one of them and had come home without a solution, and the coming home had been both the most necessary thing he had done and the thing he could not entirely make peace with. When Scott Lang arrived at the gate at the end of the road, 5 years after the snap, with a theory about time and quantum physics, and the possibility of undoing what had been done, Tony sent him away. This was not a simple decision, and it was not made from cowardice, though it might have appeared that way from certain angles. It was made from the specific fear of a father who has finally found what he was looking for, and who understands with perfect clarity what losing it would cost. He had Morgan. He had Pepper. He had the dock and the ducks and the mornings with coffee and the evenings reading to a child who fell asleep against his shoulder. And all of it was real, and all of it was good, and all of it was exactly what he had never believed he was going to have. The calculation that the request required him to perform, the weighing of what he stood to lose against what the world stood to gain, was not one that any reasonable person could expect him to complete quickly or without cost, and he did not complete it quickly. He sat with it through the night, alone in the workshop while the house slept, running the numbers that he had sent Scott away to avoid having to run, because the mind that had built the arc reactor and the armor and the Avengers tower was not a mind that could be given a problem and then simply choose not to solve it, regardless of how much it might want to. The solution, when it arrived in the way that Tony's best solutions had always arrived. Not through sustained deliberate effort, but through the specific combination of deep familiarity with the problem and the particular quality of attention that the late-night hours in a quiet workshop provided, when the ambient noise of obligation and audience had subsided enough that the mind could follow its own threads without interruption. He saw it. He sat with it. He understood what it meant that he had seen it, which was that the decision had effectively been made at the level below the one where decisions are consciously announced, and that the question was no longer whether he was going to help, but how he was going to manage telling Pepper that the life they had built on the lake was going to be tested by what came next. She already knew or suspected which was the quality in Pepper that had always made the performance of Tony's feelings redundant in her presence. She did not make the conversation easy in the sense of removing its weight, but she made it possible in the sense that the love she brought to it did not waver in response to the news, did not convert to fear or to recrimination, or to the kind of conditional support that would have made the choice feel like a betrayal of what they had built together. She asked him to come back to them. She said it simply, without dramatics, the way the most important things are said between people who know each other well enough to trust that the simplicity will carry the weight. He promised. He held Morgan in the morning before he left, her small arms around his neck and her particular smell of something sweet and something of the outdoors, and the promise he had made to Pepper was present in the holding. The understanding that this was what he was going to the city to protect, not an abstraction or a principle, but this specific child in this specific morning light, irreplaceable and entirely worth whatever came next. And so we rest here, gently, at the edge of everything Tony Stark built and everything he left behind, letting the story settle into the quiet places where the best stories go when the telling is finished. What remains is not the armor or the technology, or the arc reactor's blue light, though all of those things are beautiful in their way, but something softer and more lasting, the truth that ran beneath all of it from the beginning, that a person's greatest work is never the thing they built, but the love they allowed themselves to feel while building it. You have travelled tonight through the full breadth of what one life, extraordinary and also deeply human, can contain, the responsibility carried without complaint, the love offered imperfectly but genuinely, the willingness at the end to give everything for the people waiting at home on the lake. Carry whatever this story offered you gently now as you drift towards sleep. Let the arc reactor's light grow soft in your imagination, steady and warm, asking nothing, simply present. You're allowed to rest. The work of today is finished. The people you love are safe in your heart, and that is enough, and it has always been enough. Sleep now. Dream of docks and still water and a voice saying, "I love you 3000" into the quiet dark.